Misfits are one of the legendary Owl teams that I would rank underneath Envious and Rogue in terms of their overall tenure in Western Overwatch from 20, from mid 2016 all the way through to when Overwatch League launched at the beginning of 2018. I would put them underneath Envious and Rogue, the two winningest rosters in the West, but they were nevertheless legends. They won a number of championships, land championships. They had periods of time where they were a very good team. They had a period of time where they made a case for being the best team in the world, but I personally don't think that they ever quite reached it. And other than the Korean teams, they are one of the big bastions of these pre-Overwatch League teams. Now, the core of the team has gone on to be an Overwatch League team, but they've been through some iterations and done enough to warrant being one of the legends of the pre-Overwatch League era, independent of whether or not this roster actually performs in Overwatch League. So this team had, or rather this, it's a bit disingenuous perhaps to call them a team because really only one player survived from the beginning through to when they actually went into the Overwatch League, but they were a bit of an evolving beast. So rather than just having one team, like for example Rogue or Envious, rather than having one team that they began with, had a bit of a shuffle and came out with another team with a couple of players left over, Misfits changed players and kind of evolved, and as they mixed and matched, it came out that only actually Zebasai remained in the end because they'd changed every part. They'd changed the handle and they'd changed the blade of the axe, apart from the little screw holding them together, which was Zebasai. So that was a bit of a tangent, but this team, Misfits, had a fantastic 2016, which saw them win 2 championships, place highly in a couple of others, but dropped off in early 2017. And had very disappointing, underwhelming performances for the vast majority of 2017. They were never quite the best team in the world, but they did make a case for it in the winter of 2016 after they'd won 2 back-to-back LAN championships that they'd entered. And I'll go into the reasons why I don't think they quite reached the number 1 spot and why they made a case for it at that period of time. But as I say, they dropped off in 2017 after shuffling their roster again, and didn't quite reach that height, wasn't able to recover in the same kind of way. But they did reform in Contenders Season 1 to become one of the best teams in Europe just before the Overwatch League kicked off, and that roster transitioned into becoming the Florida Mayhem, which is where Misfits have now found themselves ending up. The core of the player, the core of the team, rather, as I said, the only consistent player is Zebasai. Zebasai is their team leader. He's a very vocal player. Has played a number of roles within the team, but started and is currently playing at the beginning of Overwatch League support for the team, Lucio support for the team. Has also played Flex support for the team, has played Flex and Flex DPS for the team as well. So he's quite a well-rounded player and has been, I would say, the brains and the leadership behind the team since it first formed, and is very much a team captain in that kind of sense. The first core of the team in mid-2016, when they really became a powerhouse of the European scene, was Zebasai as the team captain, Soon, who was a DPS player, and Nevix as well, who was their DPS player, then also played Flex support for them as well. And these 3 players really formed the core throughout a couple of different iterations they had. All 3 of them managed to take home 2 of these LAN championship wins at the Overwatch Open and then at DreamHack Winter, with excellent play from all 3 of the players. They really all had core roles within the team as well, so it does make sense to call this the core of Misfits when they had the first roster. And then they shuffled to make a full Swedish roster, and Soon is French, and Nevix ended up being kind of relegated to lower roles and then eventually removed from the team to make, when they transitioned to become the Florida Mayhem. Which was not a full Swedish team. And the second core, really, after the shuffle was Zebasai Tvik, who had joined from Rogue, and Maniten, who had joined from LG. And that core really worked for the whole of 2017. And all 3 of those players were playing kind of key positions, while other people rotated and moved around them. So the actual original roster that came to power in the middle of 2016 and looked to be one of the best European teams was Zebasai on the support role alongside Nevix. And then they had Skipjack on tank, Crew on the French flex French flex player who was playing mainly Zarya at the time. And then their DPS players were Soon and a guy called Zapri, a Danish guy who joined, who really elevated the team. When he was first brought in, he was a bit of a ladder star that they'd found kind of out of nowhere. And when they added him to the team is when they started getting a lot of big results. He added a bit more punch to their roster, gave them a real fierce DPS duo of Soon and Zapri. And they were able to roll this forward and have some very strong online results before really the LAN tournaments kicked off in the summer of 2017. Skipjack was known for, the team in general was known actually for playing quite a bit of dive composition. This was back before really dive dominated everything in 2017 and was just one of the available options. So a lot of teams like to play Reinhardt and have a 2-2-2 kind of composition. They would play Genji with the Reinhardt, let's say Genji McCree with the Reinhardt, or they would play a double DPS kind of double hit scan DPS composition with the Reinhardt as well. And some teams would play dive. It was a bit more of a mixture. The meta was less set in stone, partly because the teams were slightly worse and hadn't experimented with a lot of different stuff because they hadn't had the time, and partly just because the game had a little more balance at that point, potentially. So Skipjack was known for playing Winston within the team and having a very safe, passive Reinhardt kind of play. Crew was their beast Zarya and Flex in general, but really had a phenomenal Zarya on him. Soon was well known at that time for playing a very solid McCree and having a pocket pick of Tracer that he could go to kind of before other people started playing Tracer a huge amount, and it was really this carry kind of role for the team. And Zapri was their Genji player and their overall kind of hit scan star, the guy that they were building the majority of the plays around, while Soon provided the damage from the back, so to speak. And these guys were known for their very strong online performances. They used to be called Graviton Surge before they got picked up by Misfits. When they got picked up by Misfits, when they added Zapri, they had very strong performances in qualifiers for the two large LANs that were happening in 2017. They qualified first for the Overwatch Open, which was this 300k tournament run by E-League, which was what everybody was focused on, and these guys came in, slammed it, through first easily. This was the period of time where there was 4 top European teams. So you had Misfits, you had Reunited, you had Rogue, and then you had Creation. And Creation ended up dropping off. The other 3 carried on to become somewhat legendary teams. Reunited possibly to a slightly lesser extent. And Misfits qualified first for this by performing very well in the online tournaments. And then a few days later, or it might have even been a week later, they qualified for the Atlantic Showdown, which was another LAN tournament run by ESL, again, with some of the best North American teams, some of the best European teams. And they qualified first for that by beating Rogue 3-2. These guys were looking... there was a lot of parity between the top 4 European teams at the time in terms of their online performances. They would take games from each other fairly regularly, and there were so many smaller online tournaments going on at the time that they had the opportunity to. But Misfits did look like the best or the hottest, the most on-form European team coming into the Atlantic Showdown, which was the first big clash. Having said that, it was pretty tight. It's not like they were head and shoulders above everybody, but they did look on balance like they might have the best chance between the teams. At the Atlantic Showdown, though, it was a collapse from Misfits. Unfortunately, they had a very poor performance. Afterwards, it was mentioned in interviews and stuff like this that Zapri, who had previously been kind of their star hit scan player, a very young guy from Denmark who didn't have too much experience, only I think 17 years old at the time, had nerve issues on stage, choked a little bit, had a massive underperformance compared to really what they were expecting from him, because he was a bit of the superstar of the team, pardon me. And the team kind of collapsed around him. They weren't able to keep up the same kind of performance. They were quite a dive-heavy team in the past, which relies on being able to get picks and really open things up. You're making opportunities for yourself. You're taking the initiative in a lot of these fights, and they just weren't able to do it. They weren't feeling like their teamwork was together. And they lost to Fnatic, who were at that time the 3rd best North American team. They beat Dignitas, who were Creation Esports previously, and were also kind of struggling. This was almost the beginning of their slump, right at the beginning of the game. And then they lost to Fnatic 1-2 again the second time around. Both times failing to take the series, both times meaning that they didn't go through to even the playoffs, which was a massive underperformance from them because they were expected certainly to make the playoffs because they were in a group without Envious in it as well, who were considered the favourites for the tournament, having steamrolled through the North American portion. So this was a massive underperformance from them, and questions had to be asked. So they had a role and roster shuffle before the next LAN event that was coming up. These were two really quite back-to-back LAN events, the Atlantic Showdown and the Overwatch Open, with a couple of months in between. And Zapri didn't feel confident in his play on DPS. He had choked on stage. He was a young guy. He felt nervous about it. He realized that he'd probably been one of the large reasons that his team had such an underperformance. And instead, they tried him for a while on support, with Nevix moving to the DPS position. And Nevix has played, at this point in time, speaking just at the beginning of Overwatch League Season 1, Nevix has played basically every role that you possibly can other than tank, and has been pretty excellent at all of them in different teams. Is flex support. He used to play for Misfits, played it again later on. Flex DPS, though, as a Genji, he had some fantastic performances, but he wasn't known for it at this point. And Zapri wasn't comfortable on support either. He tried it out for a while, this role shift between him and Nevix, and actually ended up dropping out. He decided to go and focus on school, retired, and so the guy that had really taken Misfits into the limelight as one of their stars coming out of rank queue ended up retiring at the age of 17 after an underperformance in his first LAN event right before another big LAN. So it left Misfits in a bit of a pickle. And to exacerbate that even further, just before the Overwatch Open, this 300k tournament that all of their focus was on, unfortunately, Skipjack, their tank, had a family issue with illness in the family, and felt like he had to stay at home rather than compete and spend time there instead. So they had two gaps in their roster, one at either potentially the support if Nevix moved to DPS, or they could have picked up a DPS player, and one gap at tank as well. Rib is a player that Zebasai had played with previously a huge amount in TF2, spanning back about 5 or 6 years at that point, the history between the two of them. Played many LANs together, and so Zebasai brought Rib into the team to play tank. He had played tank in the past. He wasn't known as a tank. He was actually known as an off-tank at the time. But Zebasai believed in him. Rib thought that he could do a good job, and he came in. Rib was a slightly more aggressive tank player that fit their style a little bit better, in fact, and they added him into the team as a temporary stand-in. To fill the other spot that Zapri had left open, Nevix did move to the flex DPS and played Genji for them the majority of the time. Genji, Mei, stuff like this. On support, they picked up a guy called Hidan, who also was a TF2 player, was kind of hanging around the tier 2 French scene for a while and had quite a bit of talent. But in an interview afterwards, it turned out that the reason that they picked up Hidan basically was because they were so desperate for people towards the end, and he happened to have a passport, whereas some of the other people they were trialing didn't have a passport available. So in the end, they had to pick up Hidan. Now, it worked out for them because the Overwatch Open was a miraculous run for Misfits. It was unbelievable. This team that had underperformed so badly in the Atlantic Showdown had lost 2 of their core players that had been playing with them ever since their rise to fame as one of the top 4 teams in Europe. We're running with 2 stand-ins and playing a completely different style that they just pioneered before the tournament, literally a week before the tournament began, and pretty much crushed people with it. It was a fantastic showing from them, and one of the best storylines that we've had in Overwatch. The context for this tournament, the Overwatch Open, is that it was the focal point of everybody's efforts at that point in time. It ran in September, about a month and a half, I believe, after the previous and pretty much only big international LAN for Overwatch. And it was at the time when Ana was first getting introduced into the meta as well. So teams were starting to experiment with tank compositions. A Finnish team called NIP, Ninjas in Pajamas, had innovated a triple tank strategy, originally with 3 supports as well, that was performing excellently in scrims. They were dominating people. They came into a cup beforehand called the Lenovo Cup and crushed everybody with it. Other teams that had been beating them with dive compositions, like Misfits previously, came up against these tanks and they couldn't do a thing against them. The health pools were too high. They were getting nano boosted like within 30 seconds because the ult charged so quickly, and they were getting steamrolled. And so Misfits came up with this plan to try and counter NIP, who'd just beaten them in the tournament, the online tournament before the Overwatch Open, and came up with this plan to run a Mei Reaper composition that focused on isolating the tanks and bursting them down with the Reaper, and then also had incredibly powerful ultimates. You could use the Nano Boost along with the Death Blossom and have kind of a spinning Beyblade of death. You could also have the Blizzards that charged up almost every fight at that point because the ultimates were so fast back then in the game. And so they'd come up with this composition that they felt very comfortable with. Nevix was on a brand new role on Mei. Soon was playing a lot of Reaper, whereas previously he'd been majority of the time a McCree player, and they were playing with a brand new tank and support as well on Ana and Reinhardt, 2 incredibly crucial roles if you're playing against this kind of meta, this kind of composition. And Misfits, their first game of the group, they lost 2-0 to Rogue. Another top team in Europe, yes, but certainly they were expecting more of themselves than that. It wasn't even that close a game, to be honest. Misfits looked like they fell apart and got crushed, and in interviews afterwards it came to light that they had been internally kind of raging at each other, didn't have a good idea of how they wanted to work out. This is kind of what people expect from playing a tournament with 2 stand-ins. Your communication gets messy because the teams, the players within your team that want you to do really well get frustrated at the lack of teamwork and why aren't certain abilities being used at this time. But somehow Misfits were able to get resolve the differences between the personality conflicts and the hot-headed kind of behavior that they'd had in that stage of in the group stage, and managed to piece it together, get through to the playoffs, and then started to perform better than they ever had done. Honestly, they had an incredible series against Ninjas in Pajamas, who, although perhaps not the favorite necessarily for the tournament, were who everybody was looking at as the team to beat, because they had pioneered this strategy that was working so well and they were in such good form coming into the tournament. So they had an amazing series against Ninjas in Pajamas, where Misfits ended up winning 3-1. Each map ridiculously close, came down to the wire. Both of these 2 teams playing their own style and playing it fantastically against each other. Nevix had some amazing intelligent ice walls to be able to break up the tank compositions, isolate Fraggy at the front and be able to pick the Reinhardt and move through the rest of them. They had great coordination between their players as well. It was, in a sense, miraculous from Misfits, because they'd gone from such a poor performance in the groups to be able to play at this level in the playoffs, where they were clutching everything. Each individual player that had come in, Hidan, who wasn't known for talented support play particularly, not at this kind of level, was playing super well. Rib as well, who wasn't even known as a tank player necessarily, was playing fantastically. So this was a great performance from them, even just to beat NIP 3-1. Then they went on and played against Rogue, who were playing a similar style to them, and they ended up beating Rogue in the rematch. The team that had beaten them 2-0 in the groups, the team that had won the previous LAN tournament, the Atlantic Showdown, probably the best team in Europe, if not the West at that point, and they managed to get the win over them 3-2, playing this Misfits style that they'd managed to pioneer and reach an incredible level performing at, again with these standards. Then, because of the way the tournament was structured, they had come out as the champions of Europe. They'd won the European side of the bracket, and they faced Envious, who had won the North American side of the bracket. And they managed to beat Envious 3-1 in the grand final and take home by far the largest tournament in the West so far, I think, actually. The Overwatch Open remains the largest tournament that we've had in the West, and really the only thing that compared to it was the Apex seasons and stuff like APAC Premier as well that happened over in Korea. Unfortunately, Misfits, despite the fact that they won the Overwatch Open, did not get invited to these large tournaments that happened over in China and Korea. The reason for this is pretty simple, to be honest. It's because they had a poor performance in the Atlantic Showdown, and the invites for these kind of tournaments went out before they won the Overwatch Open. And so because it was such a miraculous run, because it was so unexpected, in a sense, they were a top team online, yes, but they'd underperformed at the LAN. They were coming in with stand-ins. They looked like they had an unstable roster, and then they were able to have that kind of performance. So it still was unexpected, even though they were one of the top 4 teams in Europe at the time. So because there was only 2 spots at APAC for Western teams and 4 spots in Apex, they didn't get invited to either of those tournaments, and so the team that won the largest Western tournament was actually just left in the West, while 4 of their strongest competitors went over and played in the East against the Korean teams and Chinese teams. So unfortunately, Misfits had no opportunity to showcase themselves against the top Korean teams in Apex or APAC. And neither did Ninjas in Pajamas, actually, as well, who also had a fantastic run in the Overwatch Open. It was instead Reunited and NRG who got invited to Apex. Again, just simply because the invitations had to be sent out a while beforehand, and planning had to be done in order to get them over to Korea. So they couldn't play against Rogue, who were in APAC and then Apex. They couldn't play against Reunited. And Creation, Dignitas had fallen off a cliff. FaZe had moved over to North America. So they were essentially just left on their own in Europe with Ninjas in Pajamas to play against them. Which left a strange situation as well, because APAC, the Chinese tournament, saw Rogue win the tournament, beat Lunatic High, establish themselves as the best team in the world at that point. But Misfits weren't there to challenge them, and Misfits had beaten them in that meta, playing the same kind of style at the Overwatch Open. Yes, it seemed like a miracle run. Yes, there's a very strong case to be said that Rogue's adaptability at that point would probably mean that they'd be favored in the matchup should they go head-to-head again. But literally, on paper, Misfits were ahead of them in that sense, because they got the win over them at the Overwatch Open and simply weren't there to defend their title at APAC or at Apex Season 1, in fact. So the issue with Misfits is that they were left in Europe with lower levels of competition, and they just got beaten up consistently by NIP. The argument that Misfits would have been able to win APAC Premier or even Apex Season 1 had they been invited, I think is reduced in intensity somewhat by what happened when they were left in Europe. Because when Misfits stayed in Europe with only NIP as their other real competition, they were beaten consistently by NIP. Now remember, this is the team that they beat 3-1 in the Overwatch Open with a brand new style that was built to counter NIP's tank style. And yet when it came back to online games, when they were outside of this bubble of miraculous clutch LAN performances, NIP again consistently smacked them in online matches. They played 3 best of X, so 2 of them I think were best of 3s and 1 of them was a best of 5. They played 3 separate matches though across 3 separate tournaments, and Ninjas in Pajamas beat them all 3 times. They knocked them out of the qualifiers for MSI MGA, which was a LAN event that was supposed to happen in December 2016. NIP knocked them down to 2nd seed at DreamHack Winter in the qualifiers, and thankfully Misfits were able to beat everybody else, so they got back into DreamHack Winter. And then NRP knocked them out of the King of Nordic tournament, Season 1. So it was clear that even though Misfits had had this fantastic run... Oh, by the way, this is with Skipjack back in the roster as well. So Rib had just been a temporary stand-in, and now Skipjack was back. But the team didn't think that that was, really the issue. It wasn't like Rib was performing at some insane level, and Skipjack was at the anchor that they had to carry. There was something about their style, something about the adaptability of how they were playing, something about maybe just the pure LAN clutches that you can't really do if you're just playing in consistent online tournaments, that had made them reduced in level. So they decided to shuffle their roster, and this will be a recurring theme because Misfits went through a number of shuffles. So Crew was removed from the team, and as a side note, I believe the team had clashes. There were a couple of hot-headed personalities. Zebasai can be very, I think forthright is the right word. He's very headstrong. He knows what his opinion is. He's going to state it. He has a vision of how he wants the game to be played. And Soon and Crew as well. The three of them are quite opinionated and came to a head and had clashes a couple of times within the team, I think. And Crew was in the end removed from the team. Zebasai went to the flex position to replace him, and they brought in Cooler of Quake fame to play Lucio, in fact, for the team. So this was a weird roster, and this was right before DreamHack Winter, because although NiP had been beating them, there were 2 available slots for DreamHack Winter, and so they got in as the second seed, the second invite team from Europe. So the big battle here really should have been, the big narrative that this was all leading up to should really have been, can Misfits beat NIP again at LAN? Misfits were the team that stopped NIP having a fantastic run in the Overwatch Open by executing this counter style so well against them. But then NIP had got the return blow by beating them repeatedly online and having fantastic, consistent performances against everybody. So now it's DreamHack Winter, now it's LAN time again, now they can turn up and clutch. They have a different roster that they've shuffled around, they've brought in Cooler, Zebasai's gone under the flex, can they beat NIP? This should have been the big battle. It actually didn't turn out like this. So, Misfits created this triple DPS composition that was really interesting to watch. And so instead of going for their previous style, not only had they shuffled their roster, but they'd also shuffled the entire composition that they were going to play and the whole style of the team. So they ran their flex player Zebasai on Widowmaker, then they had Soon play Tracer, and they had Nevix play Genji. And this now is much more kind of the heroes that they're known for, much more the heroes that they've been playing throughout 2017, but they started to play these much more towards DreamHack Winter at the end of 2016. And the thought process was that if you maximize the damage output and execute on targets effectively, you'll be able to burst down these tanks. You'll be able to actually dive onto a Zarya. Even if they've got the shield of the Reinhardt, you'll be able to put out enough damage that the Reinhardt has to back up into a more passive position where you'll be able to execute a dive. And we've seen this play out throughout 2017 when triple DPS became meta, but this was brand new. This was meta defining at this point. And in fact, it wasn't even... I mean, meta-defining might not even be the correct way of saying it, because other teams couldn't replicate this. This was something that only Misfits could do at this point. They had the players to do it. Most teams had an off-tank who couldn't really play DPS heroes as well. But Zebasai's aim was good enough to play Widowmaker at a high level. So they had 3 kind of DPS players that they could play around. And this was just considered at the time to be a niche strat, a pocket strat that Misfits had worked on specifically to play against the triple tank teams of the time. And so using this triple DPS strategy, they beat Fnatic 2-1, who were playing this kind of structured, very teamwork heavy triple tank system. And then they beat Complexity 3-1 as well. So they managed to get themselves to the grand final. And they were just kind of waiting for NIP to meet them in the final. And we would have this amazing grand final to decide who the best team in the West was that hadn't gone over to Korea. But instead, Fnatic actually beat NIP kind of at their own game. NIP were the grandfathers of playing this tank style, had been so dominant, again, were the team to beat coming into DreamHack Winter. But Fnatic had a fantastic map draft. Their coaching strategy from Rafflegator was excellent in terms of the maps that they were picking. They had set plays for maps like Anubis on attack, made use of things like the Sombra, which a lot of teams weren't experimenting with at that time, and managed to knock them out in a fantastic 3-2 series that really showed that Fnatic had put in the effort to counter strat and read NIP, and make sure to exploit their weakness of not being able to properly attack maps with a high ground with this triple tank strategy. And so this grand final rivalry that had been set up by the constant back and forth that Misfits and NIP had been having never came to pass. And in fact, this set Misfits up for an even easier win in their second championship victory after the Overwatch Open, because in the DreamHack Winter Finals, they beat Fnatic, and in fact, even though on paper it was a 3-2, it definitely looked a lot easier for them. NIP would have been favoured in that final had they got there. Fnatic was definitely not favoured against Misfits, and Misfits ended up getting the win. And even though, again, Fnatic played a very good system, and Fnatic had a very good map draft, it was Misfits that came away with the victory in the end, and had won 2 back-to-back championships. So this is also a really interesting stat here, because they had won 2 championship titles, the Overwatch Open and DreamHack Winter. They had failed to perform at Atlantic Showdown, but the only other two championships that they played in, they had won. And that at the time put them level with Rogue, who had won the Atlantic Showdown, the one that Misfits underperformed in, and APAC Premier, the tournament in China that they'd been invited to. So Rogue had come second in the European part of Overwatch Open, but hadn't managed to get the victory there because Misfits had beaten them. And then were unable to win Apex Season 1, which was won by Envious, and actually Envious beat Rogue. And Envious as well had 2 championship wins by the end of 2016, because they had won MLG Vegas, which happened after their victory in Apex Season 1. So they underperformed perhaps at the Atlantic Showdown, were beaten by Rogue. Then they were beaten by Misfits in the Overwatch Open and finished second, and won the North American portion, but finished second overall. They weren't invited to APAC Premier and won Apex Season 1 and MLG Vegas. So you had this really strange and interesting dynamic between these 3 teams, Misfits, Rogue, and Envious, where they'd all stopped the others getting more than 2 titles, but had kind of shared out the 6 major championships that happened in 2016 between them. Actually, there was a 7th major championship that happened, which was IEM Gyeonggi, which both Rogue and Misfits were invited to, but LW Red won that one. And this was later on in the year. But the reason that people considered Rogue as the best team in the world at one point, and then after Envious won Apex Season 1 and MLG Vegas, they were considered the best team in the world towards the end of 2016. The reason that Misfits never had this same accolade, despite winning the Overwatch Open, beating both of those 2 teams, Rogue and Envious, and then winning the next LAN that they turned up to, DreamHack Winter, the reason that they never were considered the best team in the world is because there was reduced level of competition at DreamHack Winter, and so it didn't feel like the same, it wasn't the same level of competition anymore as the Atlantic Showdown, as Overwatch Open, as Apex, for example, because many of the top Western teams had gone over to Korea and played in championships over there, like APAC Premier, which had Lunatic High and a Freak of Freaks Blue and Rogue playing in it. And like Apex Season 1, which had a huge amount of top teams, and from the West, it had Rogue, Envious, Reunited, and then NRG playing in it. But you'd removed a number of the competitive teams that would have had a shot at the title, and so Misfits had an easier run to the victory at DreamHack Winter. They also had a much larger underperformance at the Atlantic Showdown than Rogue or Envious did in their worst performances. I mean, what was the lowest that Rogue ever finished in 2016? I guess it was technically 3rd/4th at the Overwatch Open when they came second in the European portion. And Envious, the lowest that they finished, they got knocked out in the semi-finals of the Atlantic Showdown. Oh, of course, Rogue actually, of course, finished in the quarterfinals of Apex Season 1, despite looking like the best team coming into it because of the patch change that happened. But Misfits were the only one of these three teams to shit the bed at one of these tournaments, which was the Atlantic Showdown. So that was another reason that factored into why they weren't the best team in the world at any period of time in 2016. In fact, despite having these kind of accolades, they also had no opportunity to compete in Korea or China. And it was hard to argue at the beginning of 2017, and even really towards the end of 2016, when we'd seen Apex Season 1, that you could ever be the best team in the world if you hadn't competed in Korea or China, because the level of competition over there was so good. So after winning DreamHack Winter, they went through another shuffle. And I believe that this shuffle, which we called the triple shuffle because it involved Rogue, Misfits, and LG, Luminosity Gaming, I believe this was instigated by Tweak from Rogue, who wanted to make a full Swedish team. I could be wrong, but I think that was the case. And the way that it worked is that Skipjack and Soon of Misfits, German and French guy, went over to Rogue. So, thinking about this from Misfits' point of view, they lost their main tank, and they also lost one of their star DPS players, the guy that had been playing so well on McCree, had a fantastic tracer, was playing an incredible Reaper when they won the Overwatch Open. But they gained Tweak and Reinforce. Tweak, one of the best flex DPS players in the world, and Reinforce, who was a very aggressive tank when he played for Rogue, but also quite a cerebral player, had a huge amount of experience playing alongside Tweak as well. Hidan left as well to Luminosity. Cooler ended up just never joining the team. Like, he was never actually part of the team. He just was a stand-in that played for DreamHack Winter. And they got Manitin and Zave from LG. So Manitin filled in the flex role for them. Zave filled in the Lucio role. And then you had Nevix go back to support. And Zebasai went to the support role as well. No, wait, that can't be right. No, Nevix stayed on DPS. That was right. No, sorry, beg my pardon. Nevix and Zave were the two support players, and they actually put Manitin on DPS at first. They put him on hit scan, and this Swedish team was pretty interesting. You already knew that Zebasai and Nevix were very good players and could play a range of heroes and a range of roles. Tweak at this point was considered one of the best players in the world after his performances APAC Premier, Apex with Rogue, at the Overwatch Open as well, and the Atlantic Showdown, and pretty much all throughout beta. It was fantastic in 2016. Reinforce was a very good tank player. He had a unique style. It was very aggressive. It was unknown how he was really going to incorporate that into Misfits, but a solid player nonetheless. But they had changed up so much of their roster that it was a big question mark how this team was going to perform. And nobody had really heard of the two LG guys that much coming into the team. Manitin, who was an up-and-coming Swedish guy who was supposed to be very good at hitscan DPS, and Zave as well, who was their Lucio. So a lot of question marks about this shuffle from Misfits' point of view. And almost immediately, the team went and competed in Apex Season 2. I can't remember exactly how much time they'd had, but I think it was about a month since forming the roster, and they went and played in Apex Season 2. They were immediately seeded in a group of death, as happens to be the case with almost every Western team that ends up going over there somehow. So they were put in with LW Blue, the winners of IEM Kangi, who now represent New York Excelsior in the Overwatch League Season 1, and they got put in a group with Lunatic High, who now represents Seoul Dynasty in Overwatch League. So this was a crazy difficult group. You had, and at the time, these were the first and second best teams in the world. So most people had Lunatic High, I believe, as the #1 team in the world, and LW Blue as #2 team in the world. I think that's the correct way around for this period of time. So people knew that Misfits were the underdogs coming into this. It would be crazy for them to be able to get through with this brand new roster. They had a very close game against LW Blue at first, ended up trading a couple of maps back and forth, but then eventually lost 1-3. And you could tell as well as they went through the groups and eventually just couldn't stand up to Lunatic High, that this was a team that hadn't really found their style yet. And one of the recurring themes of Misfits is that Zebasai tended to use the pieces very well that he was given and come up with a style for the team. They weren't the most flexible teams in the world. The 2 championship victories that they had were where they found a composition, found a style, stuck to it, and played it the best they possibly could, and hammered it home to victory. They weren't changing things up too much. They weren't adapting to their opponents. They were forcing their opponents to play their game most of the time. And this didn't happen throughout the whole of the beginning of 2017. They just shuffled their roles around forever. They couldn't find what worked. Manitin went over to the flex role because he wasn't having a big enough impact on DPS. Zebasai moved back over to support, and they put Nevix in more of a carry DPS position. Then they realized that Nevix wasn't calling enough, so they put more of the emphasis on Tweak in that sense. They were having underperformances left, right, and center. So after Apex Season 2, they went back to Europe. So these role shuffles were happening all throughout the tournaments that I'm talking about here. So they went back to Europe, and there was only really E United left of the old guard teams. And they had made changes as well. They'd picked up triple DPS, like Rogue, were playing it in a very similar style. And Rogue were scrimming briefly, but then left for North America. NIP were out of form. It wasn't their kind of meta. The tank style wasn't working too well for them. It was all dive. And Misfits had to adapt to this. And they had to try and come up with a style that worked well for them. And triple DPS was not what was working. They had all the best triple DPS teams had a Winston that was incredibly comfortable on Winston and played an aggressive Winston, understood their limits, and was able to survive in certain situations and be able to peel back after creating space. Reinforce, I think, was far more comfortable on the Reinhardt role, had played a huge amount more of that, and even though he's a very aggressive Reinhardt, you can't play triple DPS with a Reinhardt. The dive just doesn't work. And when he moved on to the Winston, he played either a very sacrificial style where he would dive in and just try and make as much space as possible and expect the rest of his team to be able to follow up, or rely on the rest of his team to be able to follow up. And that worked in Rogue when most of the teams he was playing against were playing a more safe style. But if you're playing against triple DPS and the other team's got a Winston that's doing slightly more than you and having more of an impact in the fight, I think they really struggled in that sense to set up coherent dives. They weren't a dive team. They had kind of formed their pieces together when they were expecting Reinhardt and tanks to still be in the meta, and it changed completely at the beginning of 2017, and they couldn't keep up. So the first tournament they played in really was Overwatch Pit in Europe. They had a strong performance in the groups, actually. We thought that this might be a resurgence for Misfits because they beat... who did they beat? They beat Dignitas, I think it was, in the group stage, and had a very... they looked like they were playing pretty well. We hadn't expected them to play the dive that strongly, but they looked like they had a decent idea of what was supposed to be going on with them. They looked like a solid team. Unfortunately, when they got to the playoffs, they were beaten by E United, who were the best team in Europe at that point. And then also beaten by Dignitas, who had a very strong performance on very hot form in that cup in particular. And it was weird to see their style develop because they were playing a lot more triple DPS, trying to make it work in the playoffs, that is. Whereas in the group stages, they've been playing a bit more of the 2-2-2. They'd had Manitin on the Diva, and playing a bit of Zarya, a bit of Roadhog, this kind of stuff, and playing more tanks as whenever they could. For example, on Hollywood or Kings Row, they'd go over to tanks a little bit more and just play what they were more comfortable with rather than trying to play the meta in that sense. So this was a disappointing result for the team. At this point, people were still expecting big things from Misfits. They had been such a strong team in 2016, had won 2 championships. They had big names on their roster. People were expecting them to be a top team in Europe. After the Overwatch Pit, they added Mineral instead of Zave. Zebasai had been identified as a bit of a weak point on the team on Ana. He was getting picked fairly often in a lot of their fights. He was playing Ana and Zenyatta and seemed to be left alone in quite a lot of the situations. I don't think this was necessarily a problem with Zebasai's play whatsoever, really. He was just focused on enabling the rest of his team as much as possible, and he didn't have peel for him. The rest of his team were too focused on what was happening at the front of the fight, and they didn't have a Lucio that was peeling for them, a Diva that was peeling for them, just the team cohesion, really, to be able to disengage in the fights and protect Zebasai when he was getting dived on, or catch the dive in any sense. So they added Mineral instead of Zave, who had more passive play, more peel-oriented to keep Zebasai alive a little bit more, had apparently better calling and a bit more of a coaching role within the team, would go through VOD reviews and try and improve their play in that sense. And Mineral is now the coach of Florida Mayhem, which is the Overwatch League team that this team transitioned into. So he ended up actually just going into the coaching role, but he was originally on as Lucio for the team to try and provide a bit more stability to the backline. So then they went into the LAN with this roster. They went into Takeover 2, which was a relaxed atmosphere for sure, but had a lot of it had all of the top teams of Europe, and it had Cloud9 over from North America, and it had Rogue over from North America, who'd just come back from playing in Apex Season 3. Yeah, who'd just come back from playing in Apex Season 3. And this was a massive underperformance from Misfits. Even when they were playing their more tanky style that they'd been known for, they lost 1-3 to Cloud9, who were also playing kind of Reinhardt compositions quite a lot. Their teamwork looked all over the place. There was really no power coming from their DPS duo. It wasn't like they were properly being backed up or had the right timing to be able to get initiations out. It looked like they were doing damage and actually playing individually fairly well, but there wasn't initiative being taken and opportunities and spaces being opened up. They lost 1-3 to Hollywood Hammers as well, who was a pretty good rising talent in the scene. Really should have been a team that Misfits is beating in this instance to be able to make it through to the playoffs. Didn't even make it out of the group stage of this LAN tournament, Takeover 2, where we expect these guys to who have all the experience playing in Tavik and Reinforce have been playing in Rogue, they've played in Korea, they've played in China. The LAN performance should be where these guys step up, and unfortunately it was an even bigger underperformance than their online games. But once they were out of the groups, it was a round-robin group, so they had to play another game against Movistar Riders anyway, even though they were mathematically out. And even though Movistar Riders were a better team than both Cloud9 and Hollywood Hammers, they managed to beat Movistar Riders 3-1. So they lost to the two worst teams in their group, and they beat what should have been the best team in their group, and it was probably the best team in their group. And Misfits looked a lot better. It looked like the pressure of performing had been removed from their shoulders. They were playing freer, they were taking risks, they were taking opportunities. Now, I don't know whether this was nerves or whether they were choking at the LAN, whether they'd put too much pressure on themselves to perform, whether they'd just weren't feeling the style that had been prescribed for the team and ended up playing a lot better when it was more free and loose. I don't know quite what the genuine issue was if you really got down to it, but the results spoke for themselves that it was definitely there was some kind of mental game going into it as well. And so going into Contenders Season 0, they kept the same roster. So even after their underperformance in Takeover 2, they kept the same roster going into Contenders Season 0. So they've got Tveek and Nevix on DPS, and they keep alternating really between who plays what role. So sometimes Tveek will be on Tracer, sometimes Nevix will be on Tracer. They swap the Genji between them and the Soldier 76 because they enjoy playing more flexibly, I think, and think that that'll help them, but it didn't. And in Contender Season 0, they had a reasonable performance in qualification. I think they actually played pretty well in qualification. Then in the group stage, they had a very easy group. They were in there with NWA, a team that had been good at the end of 2016, but was rubbish in Contender Season 0. And they're in there with something called like Team Esporters Cyber Athletes or something, or was it? Yeah, it was Team Esporters Cyber Athletes, who were just like a team that had qualified but weren't really at the same level as the other teams. The only other good team in their group was Laser Kittens, and they won a game against Laser Kittens, they lost a game against Laser Kittens. So it was like an okay average performance from Misfits if you were already expecting them to be disappointing, which most people were at this point. Then when they got to the playoffs, unfortunately, because of the way that Contender Season 0 was formatted, none of those games were streamed. But the playoffs were a huge flop. Again, I don't know whether it was choke or nerves. Obviously, the stream isn't available so we can't analyze the games even because there's no demos or replays or anything. But they lost 0-3 to Bazooka Puppies, a team that they should have been trashing every time. And then they lost 1-3 to Rest in Pajamas, which was, to be fair, the beginning of a resurgence for that Finnish roster. But in general, again, should have been a team that they were beating. So this was an enormous flop for the team, and at this point it was unreasonable, I think, to continue with the roster. They had to shuffle, and they did shuffle. They made the Florida Mayhem roster, which is what they've joined the Overwatch League Season 1 with. And my theory is that they designed this roster for the meta, in a similar way to how they've thought about teams in the past, how they've built rosters in the past, as in, we know what style we want to play, or we know the meta, we're going to go out and find pieces that fit that. And this works really well if you can accurately predict the meta, as they did when they won the Overwatch Open, as they did when they're able to win DreamHack Winter. It doesn't work so well if you incorrectly predict the meta, as I believe they did when they formed this full Swedish team, where they had a lot of flexible players, and the meta ended up being set in dive rather than Reinhardt comps for months on end. So this time, it seems to me like their prediction was that we need an absolute star tracer player who can also play a number of other hitscan heroes. And then we need more power in our flex support so that Zebasai can go back to Lucio. And then we need a Winston as well, because they've been playing without somebody who was a main Winston player for a while, because Reinforced specialized in the Reinhardt, really. And he'd been out of the meta for a long time. So they brought Swoosh in on main tank, a Swedish Genji player who transitioned over to Winston when he joined the team. Is an intelligent guy, was used to playing the dive meta, knew because he had played Genji with a lot of Winstons what they needed from the dive. But that was a bit more of the question mark, was how was he going to adapt to the tank spot. The others were just dead certs. They brought in Logix on DPS, mainly playing Tracer. He was going to be their carry DPS. Now this solved one of the biggest problems of Misfits throughout 2017, which was Tvik performs the best when he's the secondary DPS for the team. When he's not your carry guy, when he's the flex who can go to anything that your team needs to add a little bit more punch, or to add the perfect counter to what the enemy team's playing, or to change the style of your team to fit the map. But he's not the guy normally that's getting all of the kills or all of the damage. Previously, when he played in Rogue, that was always AKM that he was alongside, and AKM was doing a lot of the hit scan heavy lifting, and Tvik was adding the flourish at the end to be able to roll teams or give them a strategic advantage, and his flexibility was his biggest bonus in that sense. So he was now reunited with another guy who was incredible at hit scan DPS in Logix, who was almost definitely the best tracer in Europe at this point, and had proven it on Movistar Riders many times. Zupe was brought in on support, a very good Zen player, very good Ana player, very flexible, knows his role, has a huge amount of history playing it, was going to be utterly dependable on flex support, which they hadn't had for a while, and had good communication, which was something that they complained about when they had Nevix on the team. And Zebasai was moved back to the Lucio role, where he can call a little bit more, have more of an impact in how the team plays, perhaps, this kind of stuff. So it seemed like a very good way of moving from a team that was going to underperform to a team that had a lot more firepower. It now had Logix playing there, who's a phenomenal DPS player, and it had a better support line with more structure, and it had the ability to actually dive and execute on the dives properly. So it was a well thought out roster. And in Contender Season 1, they proved it by having an unreal performance in the regular season. They went 27-2 on maps. They didn't drop a single map to anybody apart from Gamers Origin, who were a team that played a very weird style with like a Doomfist McCree, which nobody else was really playing. I think it caught them off guard a little bit, but they still won that game 3-2. And they beat everybody else without losing a map. They were unbeaten in 7 matches that they played. A very strong dive team with an overpowering DPS duo of Logix and Tvik. They were not so much insanely aggressive, but they would have Logic's harass until the team was in a bad position. Then they would dive on them. Swoosh would play a little bit more passive to make sure he stayed alive. Zebasai's right up there in the front, making sure that he's got the calls and tracking the ultimates and everything. And it was a well-executed system that worked incredibly well. In playoffs, however, this style got read a little bit, and other teams adapted to it. So much of the impetus was being put on Logix to create these opportunities, and in some cases finish them as well, that if you shut down Logix with Discord being put on him, with Diva Matrix focusing on him, with turning your support line to shoot at him or any time and just peppering him so that he has to play with less confidence, less aggression, then you can take a lot of the sting out of this Misfits, or what ended up being the Florida Mayhem lineup. So Misfits were still able to adapt and change their style up to be able to beat Cloud9, and frankly just had better individual skill than Cloud9, so they're able to skill it to some extent and won that series 3-2. Then they went into the best of 7 against Giganti and almost pulled it back, honestly. Giganti went up, I think Giganti went up something like 3-1, and Misfits were able to pull it back to 3-3 before Giganti finally won the 7th map. And this was a crazy series for a number of reasons. But really, it was Giganti playing a lot better than we'd seen them play, having a very good system. They knew how to shut down the strengths of Misfits, and Misfits tried to adapt, but it wasn't quite good enough. And it was an underperformance from Misfits, even when you say how good Giganti looked, because Misfits had wrecked them in the regular season. It was 4-0. It was 4-0 against every team. And so they were expecting to be able to win contenders and be one of the best teams in the West. And in fact, their style was exploited. So the questions for these guys coming into the Overwatch League Season 1 are, they have a roster built for the meta, and the meta's shifted, the meta's changing. Are they able to keep up? Do they have a guy who can play Mercy really well? Can they play this Diva Roadhog style that started to come in that's much more scrappy and certainly very strange? Do they have people who are super good at Junkrat? Can they play kind of counter dive styles, or not even dive at all, like completely passive? More tanky styles with Reinhardt, if that comes back in. There are a lot of question marks about this team, and they only have 6 players. The other thing is that Logix plays such a huge part in the team, creating opportunities, finishing off kills, 1v1ing people in the back, getting a huge amount of first kills for the team. So can they play a style where even if the enemy team shuts down Logix, you take advantage of all the focus that's on Logix and allow other people to step up? Do Manitin and Tweak end up being the carries for the team if Logix gets shut down? A lot of these questions still remain to be answered for the Florida Mayhem going forwards, but one thing is undeniable, and that is that Misfits have been one of the legends of the pre-Owl era, especially in 2016, but they also had a peak towards the end of 2017, just before Overwatch League as well, with this Florida Mayhem roster.